Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar in our Unconscious Bias course webinar series titled Navigating Microaggressions in Academic Medicine. Let's get everyone settled just for a little bit to make sure we're all logged in, and then we'll get started. Wonderful. We do want to let everyone know that this webinar will be recorded and posted on YouTube. All right, so before we get officially started, I'll be giving a brief intro about NRMN, the National Research Mentoring Network, and our Unconscious Bias course. Founded in 2014, NRMN is an NIH grant-funded initiative whose entire purpose is to diversify the STEM workforce. We do this by providing researchers across all career stages in the biomedical, behavioral, clinical, and social sciences fields with evidence-based mentorship and professional development programming that emphasizes the benefits and challenges of diversity, inclusivity, and culture. Our program achieves that through mentorship, networking, and professional development through our online networking platform, MyNRMN, which has over 19,000 mentors and mentees. We encourage you all to visit our website, nrmnnet.net, as we'll put in the chat, to learn more about all of our resources. So part of the resources in our network includes creating courses for our community. We started creating our first course, the NRMN Unconscious Bias course, in the fall of 2019, alongside unconscious bias experts, Dr. Zarya Solis and Dr. Maribel Fernandez. And it was finally ready to launch in July 2020 during a reckoning of racial injustice in our nation. Since then, we've had over 1,000 participants enroll to take the course. This 5-module course helps participants address their personal unconscious bias, teaches them about microaggressions, provides a solutions toolkit, develops their self-awareness, and discusses bias and disparities in medicine and healthcare. Participants also receive a certificate when they complete these modules. For those who have not taken the NRMN Unconscious Bias course, we encourage you to do so, and we'll be sending a link out in the chat. Our goal is to continue developing this course for our community. One way that we wanted to do this was by creating a webinar series surrounding the topics this course covers, which is why we launched this series. From NRMN, we want to give a special thank you to our course creators, Dr. Maribel Fernandez and Dr. Zarya Solis, and all our panelists, Dr. Amie Singh, student Dr. Zarya Solis, and Dr. Gary Hill, for making this first webinar happen. As a note, we will be having a Q&A session at the end of this panel discussion, and we ask you to ask your questions through Zoom's Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. And please ask all other technical questions through the chat feature. And now I will pass it over to Dr. Maribel Fernandez, our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabrielle. Good morning, everyone. We chose to host this panel today on the eve of June 19th or Juneteenth. Juneteenth, also is known as Freedom Day, Liberation Day, and Emancipation Day, is a holiday celebrating the emancipation of those who had been enslaved in the United States. Originally celebrated in Galveston, Texas, it is now celebrated annually on June 19th throughout the United States. Juneteenth is commemorated on the anniversary of the date of June 19th, 1865, the announcement of the General Order Number 3 by Union Army General Gordon Granger, proclaiming freedom from slavery in Texas. General Order Number 3 is transmitted through the news of the Emancipation Proclamation across Texas and freed all remaining enslaved people in the state. It was issued by Union General Gordon Granger on June 19, 1865 at Ashton Villa upon arriving at Galveston, Texas, over a month after the formal end of the American Civil War and 2 years after the original issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. June 19th commemorates the announcement of the order. Juneteenth commemorates the order commencement of the order, Juneteenth, originally celebrated at the end of slavery in Texas, is now increasingly recognized as the symbol of racial justice and freedom nationwide. And today, President Biden will sign a bill to establish Juneteenth as a federal holiday. Much awaited and appreciated today. So thank you to all of our panelists who have carved out some precious time out of their busy schedules to be with us today so that we may learn on the eve of Juneteenth and never forget the generational trauma endured by our fellow citizens, even to this day. So it is my honor to introduce to you our panelists. Our first panelist, Dr. Bronwyn Singh. Dr. Singh is currently an assistant professor at Touro University, California, College of Osteopathic Medicine, and enjoys teaching and connecting with students. She is passionate about serving the community and practices family medicine at Solano County Family Health Services in Vallejo, California. Her interests include integrating osteopathic manipulation into primary care, women's health, and healthcare equity. Dr. Singh graduated from Western University Comp in 2011. She completed her family medicine residency at UMass in Massachusetts and an additional OMM/NMM year at Berkshire Medical Center in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, before moving to Northern California. She is boarded in family medicine and OMM/NMM. In her free time, Dr. Singh likes to hike and backpack with her partner Justin and their dog Maisie. She also enjoys cooking, gardening, and a good book or movie. Thank you, Dr. Singh, for taking the time to be with us this morning. Our second panelist is student Dr. Zarya Solis, a self-determined changemaker. Zarya is a third-year osteopathic medical student who is committed to anti-racism initiatives and actionable solutions to improve health food access in food deserts. As founding president of Western UComp's chapter of White Coats for Black Lives, she has collaborated with university decision makers to construct an environment that produces future health sciences professionals edified in cultural humility and anti-racism. She is currently most passionate about the work she is doing to both contribute to the scientific literature encompassing food deserts and plan a new food pharmacy at Western U to bring health food to the surrounding underserved communities. As a lifestyle and fitness model turned medical student, Zarya has developed a unique perspective when it comes to influence and leadership. Galvanized by Dr. Charles R. Drew and Dr. Marilyn Hughes Gaston, she aspires proactively to contribute to the standardization of food pharmacies, which she hopes will be enforced by the future U.S. Public Health Services Central Policy as a life-saving practice implemented by all hospitals to promote health in underserved communities across the nation. Thank you, student Dr. Zarya Solis. Our third panelist, Dr. Linda Grace Solis, who is an assistant professor of applied humanities at the University of Incarnate Word School of Osteopathic Medicine in San Antonio, Texas. She is dedicated to education, particularly in the medical education field, where she encourages learners to become holistic, open-minded, and culturally and socially aware physicians. Dr. Solis is also passionate about opening doors for individuals who are considered underrepresented in medicine and about increasing diversity in all aspects of medical education. Dr. Solis is also a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, working with organizations desiring to increase their constitutional diversity and create a more inclusive and equitable culture. Dr. Solis holds a bachelor's degree in psychology, master's degree in higher education administration, and earned her PhD in leadership studies at Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio. She's honored to serve in volunteer leadership roles for several national and local organizations, including the Council of Diversity and Equity at the American Association of Colleges of Osteopathic Medicine and the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio Commission. She also serves on the Leadership Council of Travis Park Church and on the Board of Directors for the National Healthcare Diversity Council. Dr. Solis is married to Mr. Felix Solis III. She is an avid reader of both fiction and nonfiction and believes that all books are improved with the addition of cats, coffee, and chocolate. Dr. Solis, thank you, and we're looking forward to your cats visiting us during this discussion. Our last panelist is Dr. Gary R. Hill. Dr. Hill is a graduate of Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. He completed a 3-year internal medicine residency in Michigan. Dr. Hill is board certified in internal medicine. He is a fellow in the American College of Osteopathic Internists and a graduate of the Osteopathic Health Policy Fellowship and steps towards academic research fellowship or the STAR programs. Dr. Hill participates in community, church, and civic organizations and is involved in health initiatives. He has been recognized and honored in Who's Who in Black South Florida and was nominated for the Student Life Achievement Awards while in Nova Southeastern University College of Osteopathic Medicine. He speaks nationally on health disparities and disparities in cardiovascular disease among African Americans. Following his residency, Dr. Hill worked as part of the National Health Service Corps in the community health centers, where he guided the largest community health center in the state of Alabama. Dr. Hill has held many leadership positions in national medical organizations. He is presently an associate dean for the Edward Via Colleges of Osteopathic Medicine, where he serves as associate dean for multicultural affairs and inclusion and is also associate professor of internal medicine. He has written treatises, Medicare Modernization Act and its impact on access to affordable care, the privatization of Medicare, and the Paul Wellstone Mental Health Equitable Treatment Act. His interest is related to health policies that address access to medical care, healthcare disparities, medical prevention, rural healthcare, and vulnerable populations. His research interest is related to diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and he has participated in numerous research projects, all of which he has served as the principal investigator. Dr. Hill, thank you for taking the time this morning to be with us on this panel. All right. Thank you to the team at NRMN. Thank you to Dr. J.K. Vishwanatha, to Damaris Javier, to Gabrielle Salah, and so many others who have directly or indirectly made this discussion possible today. I am Dr. Maribel Fernandez Paul. I currently serve as Chief Diversity Officer for Western UComp and Comp Northwest, Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students to Comp Northwest. I also serve on ACOM's Council of Diversity and Equity, and I'm honored to shepherd and moderate this discussion today and learn with you all from our esteemed panelists. So the topic of our discussion today is navigating microaggressions in academic medicine. Negative micro-messages or microaggressions are pervasive throughout American life. In academic medicine, it is not unusual for physicians, students, and faculty to be on the receiving end of negative micro-messaging, whether from a patient, a student, or a colleague. During this discussion, we're hoping our panelists will share real-life examples of microaggressions, how they responded, and how they wish they had responded. So let's start with my first question to you all is, could you please share about your journey, about your experiences and the people who helped you shape the person you are today? I would like to invite Dr. Singh to begin with this question. Dr. Singh, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Sure, so I'm happy to share a little bit about my history. So my ancestors are from Canton, China, but I was actually born and raised in South Africa, in Johannesburg. So we immigrated to Long Island at the age of 5. And I think most of my childhood was more growing up as a New Yorker, playing basketball. I love science. And I think the people who influenced me the most were my parents and my sister. And I was fortunate to grow up with very supportive friends. And I think along my journey in graduate school, college, and even my medical training, I've had a really nice, diverse group of people who are very supportive, who've been able to inspire me. And I think it's just really influenced of who I am today in terms of more of a good listener. I'm really trying to understand people's stories, because I understand a lot of how I look is just the surface of necessarily what a larger story is. And I always strive to make sure I see the whole person. And I'm also really fortunate to be on this webinar with such wonderful people.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I'd like to, student Dr. Zarya Lewis, if you would respond to that question.
Sure. So from an early age, I would say I was keenly aware of race, and that is because I'm biracial. My mother is white, my father is Black. And growing up, we were probably the only, mixed family in town. So going to the store was always being stared at, asked questions about, if we went to the store with my mom, people were baffled because we didn't look like her, right? And if we went to the store with my dad, it was less of a kind of spectacle, but still we were far more fair than my father is. So I think kind of being so keenly aware of race from such an early age meant that my dad, and really just being a person of color, especially from Black descent, my dad from a very early age educated my sisters and I about our history, about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Though Malcolm X often is demonized, my dad celebrated him and explained that they had two different approaches, but they both had an impact. And from one of my earliest memories actually is of my dad removing me from a classroom where there was a racist teacher. And this teacher had, done something. He actually made me I had thrown away a sandwich and made me get it out of the trash and was going to have me eat it. And I didn't tell my dad until the next time he was a substitute. The next time that teacher came to school, and my dad took me out of the classroom. And so that's one of my earliest memories of my dad coming to my defense and protecting me against racism. And with my mom, I think that she is my earliest example of a true ally. She came from a family that wasn't too excited about the fact that she chose to be with a Black man. So having those kind of conversations pretty regularly, I can remember my mom kind of having conversations with my grandma and different family members, explaining, when you do this, this is not okay, or when you do this, this means this. My mom even called my middle school and my high school at one point in time, because unfortunately the administrators allowed students to have Confederate flags on their backpacks, little emblems. And so my mom, multiple times had called in and said, hey, this is going on, this needs to stop. So I think she was a prime example of somebody who's using her privilege to advocate for marginalized communities. And I was fortunate to have that example pretty early. Other than that, I would say that more recently, Dr. Guidry at our university is such a phenomenal example of just, I call her a matriarch. She's just an example of grace and presence, and she always stands in her truth, but she'll do it with love. I think Dr. Barnes is another prime example of somebody who has wisdom and foresight, and usually can look at things from a broader scope, so we can more strategically move as we move forward anti-racism initiatives. And you, Dr. FP, you're such a prime example of consistency and altruism and just unconditional love. So I'm very thankful to have all of you as my mentors. I think the last example I'll give is of Daryl Davis, who's a blues musician. And I don't know if many people know about his story, but this man set out to meet with members of the Ku Klux Klan and asked them, how could you hate me if you don't even know me? And in that process, he formed friendships with these men, so much so that they could not wear those robes anymore. At the end of his kind of journey, 200 Ku Klux Klan members surrendered their robes. So much, I think three of those members were very high up in the Maryland chapter, and that completely dismantled the KKK in the state of Maryland. So one of the takeaway messages that I learned from his story is to have intelligent and polite conversations. And that is something that I've attempted to do in my leadership position at Western U, is to maintain intelligent and polite conversations so that we can all grow and be collaborative.
All right, thank you, Zarya. sorry, I had to look at this. So the person's name again, Bethlen is asking, I'm going to just say it before I forget. Daryl Davis? Yes, thank you. Thank you, Zarya. Next is Dr. Solis. Could you walk us through your journey and what led you to this discussion today?
Absolutely, yeah. First of all, thank you for this forum. It's really great, and I'm learning already, so thank you all. So people are often surprised at a white woman in a role for fighting for justice, equity, and inclusion for everyone, for racial and social justice. And so, you know, I grew up in a town of 900 white people in central Illinois. And, you know, everything I learned about being a person of color was from TV. Now, mind you, this was in the 60s and 70s. So there was no cable, no internet. There were 3 TV stations. And so my, you know, my experiences with people of color all came from the TV, and that you can imagine, right? You know what the TV shows were like back then. And some of them were okay, and others of them were like, so not okay. But my mom and dad had sort of been out. They were 4th generation in this little town, but they had been out in the world. My dad had fought in the Korean War in the 1st Integrated Army. And so he had friends who were Black. He had friends who were, you know, Italian, like all different races. And not just friends, but people that he went into battle with, right? Who had his back and he had their back. And that profoundly influenced his outlook. At the same time, my mom was living in Newport News, Virginia, and dismayed by the signs everywhere saying whites only, on water fountains, quote unquote, coloreds only, no dogs or Jews allowed, right? Like she was horrified. And so they determined to raise their children differently, despite being in this little bitty town full of people who looked like us. The diversity was like some people were Catholic and some were Protestant, right? Like that was it. And so of course that absolutely impacted my worldview. And then, you know, I also remember, I always say I have an overactive empathy gene. My dad told a story about me when I was in 1st grade. My teacher spanked me because I ate my mashed potatoes at lunch with a spoon. And so I didn't understand. And so my dad came and picked me up from school, and you know, he knew what happened. They called home or whatever. And so I was like, Dad, why is she so mean? And he said, and he told me about this woman's experiences. She had a son who was in prison. Her husband was disabled because he had been in a farm accident. And I mean, she was just under a lot of stress. And my dad explained all this to my little like 6-year-old self. And I don't remember, I remember the conversation, but I don't remember my response. But Dad always told me that I responded with, well, that poor lady, it's no wonder she's mad all the time. And he said, I knew right then she was gonna like major in psychology and her worldview would be like amazing. And so, so all of those things sort of culminated into me ending up in this diversity, equity, and inclusion role. I have to give a shout out to the founding dean where I worked previously in the previous medical school. She was instrumental in helping me understand. She was a Black woman, and she was instrumental in helping me understand how I could be effective as a white woman and a white straight woman in this space of justice, equity, and inclusion. As Dr. Dana McDowell, and she really started me on this path. So. Yeah, so that's me. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Solis. Dr. Hill, your turn.
Thank you, Dr. Fernandez. Paul, I am so excited already to be a participant and actually in the audience of this wonderful group of individuals that you have assimilated on this extremely extremely important topic, and so very, very very timely. I can't say enough to commend the committee and those who are bringing this to our attention, because it has not always been at our attention. So I think so very, very timely. A little bit about myself and my journey. And we've heard some of the my previous colleagues speak, and there was an undertone of race within much of the conversation. And microaggression, as we know from its terminology beginning somewhere in the late 70s or early 80s by a professor out of Harvard University, became a terminology that was not always used, at least not by me. I am a physician by training. That's my expertise. And so it was not always used. But all of my life, much as what you have heard from the previous speakers, has been centered around race. And has been centered around race and from the perspective of a minority within that race. And so the colloquialisms that are used today as we bring these concepts of diversity and inclusion and equity and intersectionality are bringing terms to those processes and those events that occurred within my life. It was interesting to hear a student, Dr. Lewis, talk about her father. I guess her father and I have something in common as to who some of our heroes, sheroes and heroes are, if they were students of the 60s and 70s, because those were my years of growing up. So I had many, many influences, the majority of which came out of a racial origin and a struggle for civil rights. As I grew, I found that the origin was not necessarily just here in the United States. And I was also interested to hear my colleague student, Dr. Singh, talk about having spent time in South Africa doing part of her journey. And the apartheid, which became very, very real, and the heroes and heroines and sheroes during that particular struggle. And then to hear my other colleague, Dr. Solis, talk about her father's experience in an integrated army. These very valuable experiences, I think, make up that tapestry of what we're going to be talking about today. Fortunately, I was blessed to have good parents, what I call good parents, but good is a term that doesn't have great value. So let me describe them. They were people of character. And if that means something to you, good. I quote my life's journey using Robert Louis Stevenson to say, it's not the seeds that is not the harvest that you yield every day, it's the seeds that you plant. And those seeds that we plant hopefully will be the fruit for someone else's labor as they continue the journey. So I'm just very, very excited to be part of this discussion today, and I look forward to continue conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Thank you to everyone for sharing. I actually do have one follow-up question. Dr. Singh, you mentioned this, and Dr. Hill brought it up too, and I was very curious. I made a note of it to follow up. Could you walk us through that just your life experiences in terms of juxtaposing it? You said your ancestors were from China. You were born in South Africa, moved to New York City, and now you're here on the West Coast. And as Dr. Hill pointed out, South Africa have found itself in very much in the position, especially today, that we're observing finally in 2021. We are now today observing Juneteenth as a federal holiday, and as a federal observance of what happened for generations. Could you speak just a little bit about that journey for you, Dr. Singh?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, I think it's, for me, I think I'll just introduce a little bit more about just what it was like, I guess, as being a Chinese South African. My ancestors, I think, immigrated to South Africa initially for because of mining diamonds and gold, and realized very quickly that working conditions were not good. And a lot of, I think, Chinese who immigrated to South Africa at that time realized that they would have to change their jobs and try other things in terms of way of making income. So that was, I think, my grandmother was about a teenager when apartheid actually was started in South Africa. And it was very interesting to hear their stories about what it was like and how it's influenced, I think, who I have become. For example, they didn't like to talk about it. I think it's very hard for some of the older generations to talk about their previous experiences if they were quite painful. But the reason, Chinese were also thought, and at that level, they were considered at the same level as Blacks. So even a lot of Chinese South Africans actually are Catholic now, because that was the only way to really get any other education besides going to schools that really didn't have a lot of good resource and skills. So we're Catholic because of that story, because we transitioned. And then I think I was very young when we immigrated. I was 5 years old. So I think it was something that I was also aware of as a child growing up, and just understanding that no one really looked like me. There were, of course, a couple families that were different, but just never feeling like there was necessarily a community that I necessarily fit in. But I think over my own experiences, it was interesting. I've talked about this with my sister, just because we've reflected on that. It's just, what was that like? I think it was unconscious at the time. We were kids. We just wanted to fit in and do what we wanted to do. And there was a lot of just we didn't learn a lot about our history. We just kind of became, what could we do? What were our interests? We played a lot of sports. Only, I think, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot more reflecting of what was that like for us? What was it like to not really have mentors who look like us, role models in the community? And then I think being a New Yorker, I think I learned to be a little bit more vocal as I grew up. And then even in my training, as I've moved around different parts of the country, I think that's always a big question. People who are you? What is your story? And then if I tell them my story, they're like, whoa, what is that like? And I think that there's times where I don't actually even really know, because the lines are blurred so much. And it's not like I've had a whole lot of time always to sit and reflect what meant what. But yeah, I guess that's, I think, where I am with the story. Hopefully it gives you a little bit more insight.
Yes, thank you. That was very helpful. So I'm going to move on to my second question. And Dr. Solis, I'm going to ask you to lead your response on this one. When did you hear of the concept of microaggressions first, and how did it shift for you from the theoretical realm to affecting your life experiences, and how?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to say, Dr. Singh, student Dr. Lewis, Dr. Hill, y'all are the reason I love doing this work. I love being able to hear these stories of people's lives, and yeah, it's just really cool. So thank y'all for sharing. And so I first heard the term microaggression probably in about 2011, 2012, just as I was really sort of getting into the practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And my mentor at the medical school I was at asked me to attend a training in Washington, D.C. That was hosted by Ross Consulting, Howard Ross, and he's a big name in unconscious bias research and things like that. And so I went to that training, and it was while we were talking about unconscious bias that I learned about microaggressions. I'd observed them before, right? But I didn't know they had a name. Like I didn't know it had a name, and I didn't understand the impact that it had on people of color and women, and particularly women of color. So that was a really eye-opening training for me. And I really look back at that and consider it really like seminal in my own interest in unconscious bias and microaggressions, and my own sort of like drive to help people understand this better, white people understand this better, so we can quit harming our peers. And so it is real to me every single day because of my learners at the medical school that I'm at. I'm the faculty advisor to the Student National Medical Association, which is the Black student organization, to the Latinx Medical Student Association, and to our Pride in Practice group, as well as several others, Muslim Student Association and things like that. And I'm delighted to be their faculty advisor. And so when microaggressions happen, my learners will come to me and say, this happened today in clinic. This happened today with a professor. This happened today with a classmate. How do I navigate this? What do I do? Especially when there's that power differential, right? Like they're a third-year clerk and it's their preceptor or attending resident who microaggresses against them. And so that's their life every day, especially for my Black students. I will say that is their life every single day. It's like trying to find healthy ways to navigate through all of this unhealthy stuff that's happening to them. And so that's why, you know, it's real life. It affects them every single day. And because it affects them, it affects me, because I am honored to be the one and humbled to be the one that they come to for help in navigating these things. So that's why unconscious microaggressions, I feel like they don't happen to me a lot, but they happen to people that I really care about, and that with my students that I will say that I love. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next question, I wanted to invite if there was another panelist that would like to contribute to that question. Just to remind you, the question was about this, the shift in consciousness from a theoretical concept, microaggressions being a theoretical concept that you hear, versus it sinking into your life experiences. I thought I'd ask before we move on to the next question.
If nobody else wants to chime in, I'd love to kind of be the other side of Dr. Solis, being the student of color who does experience microaggressions. And I will say, interestingly, I experienced it like many people of color. I experienced it far before I even knew the concept. So when I read the definition, it was like, oh, that's what it is. If anything, it brought validity to what otherwise would be kind of minimized to your being sensitive. You know, that's a common kind of gaslighting technique used societally to try to minimize the experience that people of color have to endure. And so it being so real, I don't think that it ever was theoretical to me, from my view. And, you know, I just want to highlight, and I know that we know this, but the same bias behind microaggressions is the same bias that results in Black maternal mortality being 3 to 4 times that of white women. The same bias behind the infant mortality being 3 times that of white infants, Black infants being 3 times that of white infants when cared for by white physicians. And it's the same bias behind the fact that Black males are incarcerated at 40% when they only make up 6% of the population. And so I do think that while I think people tend to like to minimize microaggressions to micro with that word, and I've even heard people say, well, the aggression's a little strong. It's not. It's not. It's the reason behind so much morbidity and mortality along racial lines. And so it is something that needs to be talked about, addressed, and addressed seriously.
Thank you, Zarya. I was just thinking about the whole contradiction of the term micro, right? So when we use, for those of us, most of us are in the medical field and scientists, and we hear the word micro and nano, and we think, oh, it's tiny, it's a wee bit, you know, it's not mega. But there's a saying, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts as well. I mean, when we repeatedly endure microaggressions day in, day out, from multiple angles, it feels the micro shifts into the mega impact. And so thank you for bringing that up as well. Also, I'm just going to throw this in here too, is that I'm an immigrant. I grew up in a culture that was, I would say, has, beautiful culture, but definitely has its own flaws. And for me, misogyny was the one that definitely held me back and I struggled with. So when I did move to the United States, I was very, very grateful for everything, any opportunity that was offered to me, the freedom, the dignity of who I was as a woman, and my body was dignified and humanized in the way that it hadn't before. And so I was very grateful. And even though, so when I endured those microaggressions, they felt like almost an ungrateful sense of reaction from my end. Is I should be grateful for this opportunity. But eventually, being in the field, teaching, learning from students, it's also important to me to keep learning about it, because I myself perpetuate every day, probably unintentionally, mostly, hopefully, but do perpetuate microaggressions. And so the learning and understanding for me became very important in a practical sense. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our second question. And Zarya, I'm going to put you on the spot for this one. Could you talk to us about how do your many identities, and you talked about it a little earlier, your race identities. You're wearing your white coat today. Thank you for that symbolism. So many identities coming together for you. How do your many identities and backgrounds come together to help you take a stand or feel empowered to stand against microaggressions?
Thank you, Dr. FP. So again, I think that's a couple of things. I identify as Black, though ethnically I'm biracial. Though I feel that society sees me as Black, most people can't tell that I'm biracial. My experience socially probably is that of a Black person, but I do want to acknowledge that, one, my being fair complected, and two, my being biracial and half white gives me white adjacency. So there is more privilege associated with my identity because of those things. And, it's important for me to acknowledge that colorism is real. It's important for me to recognize that as I'm leading movement at the university, for Western U, would I have been embraced the same way if I was darker complected, right? And so I think acknowledging that from the start and trying to dismantle it and using whatever privilege I have to dismantle it is a major factor that I try to keep in mind. And I think that works really across racial groups, because the hierarchy inherent to having race stratification, Black people tend to be at the bottom of that totem pole and white people at the top, which means that the other racial groups fall somewhere in between, meaning that there is white adjacency ascribed to those groups and there's privilege ascribed to those groups. And so while I want to acknowledge that all people of color experience a degree of oppression and microaggressions, all different groups have different forms of privilege as well. And using your privilege to dismantle racism is the goal. And that's what I try to model. It's what I try to do. And being a medical student, it's interesting because I'll give you an example of when I went to the dentist one time. I went in, I had faux locks in my hair, and the woman was asking me about my hair, touched my hair without asking. I get into the dental chair, I'm waiting, and just the conversation that the dentists were having with me it was just so clear. They're like, oh, this is somebody who's probably not educated, doesn't know what's going on, maybe hasn't had care for a while. I felt very unimportant. And I couldn't believe it. It was starting to get a little overwhelming. And then the moment I said, I'm a medical student, everything changed. Everything changed. All of a sudden they're asking questions and talking about where I will rotate and what I want to do. And all of a sudden I mattered. And so though I don't like that feature of society, you have to be somebody, if you're somebody of color, to be important, to matter, to be treated like a human that has value. I also want to acknowledge that there's privilege in that. And I can use that to my advantage, which is what I am trying to do as a future healthcare professional. When I go on rotations, even with the creation of the food pharmacy, I'm using the privilege inherent to being a medical student and future physician to move that line and to eliminate racism and to eliminate structures that perpetuate racism.
Thank you, Zarya. That was very, very helpful. And, you know, just the that example that you just shared, it was the nuances and the shifts in how you're seen, and almost went from an exotification to a humanization because of your work. So thank you for that. Dr. Hill, my next question is for you. And I'll start with this is personal for me to have chosen for this question for you. You and I have been serving on the Council of Diversity at ACOM for a long time now, I think since 2017, 2018, I think. And one of the things that you have done for me, Dr. Hill, whether you realize this or not, you have been an amazing ally for me as a woman of color, as a non-DO, you know, so many aspects that I see myself. Maybe the world doesn't see me, but I see myself sometimes on the margins of those discussions. What you have done for me repeatedly when we meet for our meetings is you have been that ally for me that draws me back in and almost says to me and to the people around me, Maribel's voice belongs at the table. And so I see you as one of my strongest allies. When I leave those meetings, I take that gift with me. So speaking of allyship, could you speak to how do you navigate that role as an ally? Maybe you don't even realize that you've done, you know, that you've given me this gift, but how do you navigate that in the many worlds that you work through in, you know, in your academic role, in different committees? Yeah, would you speak on that, Dr. Hill?
Well, thank you, Dr. Fernandez, Paul, for those very, very kind words that I would dare say I don't know that I'm deserving of. But I'm having such a wonderful time listening to my colleagues speak that I dare say that my words may sound shallow. But allyship is so important and extremely important at this particular time. The COVID-19 pandemic has been described by some as a pestilence from heaven. And as a result, there is a reckoning that's going on, not only in the United States, but around the world. And that reckoning is the obvious disparities that we all know and are seeing and talking about. Those reckonings, those obvious disparities, which were always present, are now being revealed. And the language that has always been there, as Dr. Lewis mentioned, was given a term as microaggression. So our work has to be championed at this particular time and championed beyond us, because there is an affront to this work that's going to make our challenge more difficult. Let me be more specific to that. It's not our discussion today, but it is part of our discussion today. What we have heard today from each of us is our truth and some opinion, but mostly just truth. The concept of critical race theory, which is now seen to be controversial, is more truth. And so the echoing of a truth has a great enemy, Everything in nature has an enemy. Truth also has an enemy. If you talk about the concept of Black Lives Matter, that has an enemy. If you talk about Hannah Jones's The 1619 Project, which I would encourage us all to look into, that has an enemy. The enemy is one. It has many different faces for many different origins, many different attacks. It has one, and that is the enemy of truth. And so when you talk about microaggression, those are people who have not accepted or willing to even discuss the level of truth in which we are hopefully wanting to discuss today. So back to your question on creating allies. Allyship came to me as a diametrically opposed to my personality. I have described myself personally as a social loner. I have no problems being by myself. Give me a good book, something to drink, maybe some music. But in order to make change, it required me to get out of that comfort zone, that niche which Gary lives in. And so I started as an individual physician, changing in the office one patient at a time. Not very good. I said, I got to do something about that. So I started working in community health centers. Changed community health center, not good enough. I said, let me go into academic medicine to teach medical students, not so much medicine. They can learn medicine in a book. That's where I got it from. It's in a book. You don't need anybody to teach you what I learned out of a book, but you can't become a doctor out of a book. That you do need mentorship, you do need guidance, you do need hands-on, you do need to see it. And then while I was a physician, I took a health policy with Dr. Barbara Ross Lee and learned about policy. And it is policies that drive larger scale changes. And that's when I began to find allies within and without of the medical communities to help form or to create, not necessarily policies, that's part of it, but to create programs that can effectuate change. I dare say that without allyship, and I have found them and are finding them, that without allyships, we are like a single ship sailing across an ocean in a distressed weather day, trying to get to the other side. So I would invite all of us, back to your question, to find those groups, those organizations who think like us. That doesn't mean they are us, they think like us. In other words, like this. If you feel put upon, I feel put upon as, for example, a Black male. So therefore, if you're not a Black male, you can't help me. Oh, yes, you can. I feel put upon because I can't adopt children because I'm in a same-sex marriage. Well, the same one that has problems with me as a Black male has problems with you with same-sex marriage. I feel put upon because I'm an Asian person, and the reason we had a pandemic is because it came from China, and that's why. That's the same person. We have different arguments. We have different issues of bias and prejudice. This is Pride Month. I feel put upon because of my sexual orientation. Well, if I can't see the larger enemy, which is the enemy of truth and choice and justice, then I'm stuck fighting just for Black males and just for Black people. Or I'm stuck just for Asian people. I'm stuck just for the homosexual community. Or I'm just for this or that community. And so allyship is extremely important because we have a common enemy, and it's the enemy of truth. Thank you.
Very well said. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hill. Dr. Singh, I have a question for you. You are a physician, you are a faculty member, you are have so many roles. Could you speak a little bit about how you work within the many systems that you find yourself every day to dismantle those systems of oppression and systems that exclude others, maybe as an ally as you see yourself, but exclude others and dehumanize? Could you speak to that? Thank you.
Or yeah, so I think I've been faculty at Thoreau for almost about 2 years now. So I spend half my time in the county clinic in Vallejo, and then half my time on campus with our students. So especially being in Vallejo up in Northern California, it's a really diverse city because of its history with the military there. It's about 25% white, Asian, Latinx, and Black. So we have patients who come to Vallejo from many walks of life, and also besides just their race, like socioeconomically, immigration histories, trauma histories. So I feel like how I'm trying to dismantle systems that exclude and dehumanize is basically understanding my role as a physician, understanding where our patients are coming from, what their story is, what their experiences are. So like Dr. Hill was saying, his working his way through the systems, trying to figure out the impact. I'm at that stage now, just 6 years after my residency, really trying to promote that with every patient interaction, making sure that I'm addressing what the person in front of me has experienced, making sure I'm helping them navigate the system, advocating for them, understanding that there's many more factors that go behind what they're presenting with, and making sure I understand that story and how to really impact their lives from the positive aspect. I think that also being said, like, especially when now there's also more of a spotlight on anti-Asian hate, I think there are some patients who haven't had positive experiences, maybe from someone from Asian descent, whatever that experience may be. So I think what I try to do is just represent, as an Asian woman of color physician, being able to be like, I see you, I can hear you, and hopefully one positive experience at a time will really help patients understand that there are some people who will stand up for them, and it doesn't really matter what their story is. And then I think just flipping over how I have to kind of switch roles a little bit too, finding myself as faculty at Thoreau, and also being a young physician, a woman of color. That's also been an interesting way to learn how to navigate, because I have really felt like, especially from the student body, they're looking for people to, they see me as a mentor. Maybe I haven't seen that myself, in myself just yet, as I'm still like very early into my career, but seeing that I can play a role, talk about my experiences with microaggressions, how I've learned to navigate that, and supporting their voices. I think in my world now, just as like faculty, is supporting what the students need and talking about what they're seeing as their experiences, like Zarya is saying, and she's been so amazingly vocal at Western now, hearing what the students need and help advocating for that, and seeing from the faculty side and where we need to continue to progress and change and be a voice of advocating for them as well. So it's a role I'm enjoying, and I'm still learning and trying to figure out, especially coming out of this year with COVID and being remote learning, but then at the same time being like at the clinic in person basically the whole time, how to still make time and make some impact day to day. I think that's what I'm still trying to figure out, but making slow progress, but progress nonetheless.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I feel like I need to share this. What I'm hearing and what this discussion is bringing together for me from all of you today is that no matter what, I think what I'm hearing from you is that you're calling on all of us to be agents of change. And sometimes we are agents of change in what we think are, small proportions, or maybe we don't know that we are affecting or being an ally in the way that we need to, or someone needs us to be. But in many ways, what all of you have shared today is in big ways and in small ways, whether it is to dismantle systems or whether it is to bring one voice to the table, whether it is to extend understanding, like Dr. Solis said, your example of you as a little girl, Dr. Solis, or Zarya, your sharing of Daryl Davis is putting ourselves out there, and to share and make connections as human beings, and change the system, take a whole group of people in Maryland who felt the calling to the KKK and turned out to have personal relationships. So thank you. That was very, very, I was looking for something, that was moving me. And this feeling of agents of change in different proportions is really moving me today. I want to ask all of you this question really quickly in a few words, and then we'll go to questions. So my question to all of you is, if you were to go back to let's say your younger self, I won't give you a number. I was going to say 5, 10, 15, no, depending on where you see yourself on your journey. If you were to go back to your younger self, what would you like to say to them about the resiliency and the ability that you've achieved to flourish despite enduring prejudices in many ways along your journey? What would you like to say to them? We have students that are attending and listening to this webinar today, and I think we might inspire them to hear from you about what you might say to your younger self. So let's start with Dr. Solis.
Oh gosh, I've been thinking about this. So yeah, I think I would tell my younger self to be more courageous, to not be afraid to speak up when you see injustice. So when I was in high school, all white high school, of course, we played other teams, other high schools in sports and things like that. And there would be comments about the players if they were Black or Hispanic or whatever. And I always felt it was wrong, and I felt guilty for not saying anything, but I also was a teenager myself, very immature. And so I would look back and I would tell myself, don't be afraid to speak out. You're going to go away to college. You're going to leave this little podunk, pardon me if anybody's from there, you're going to leave this little bitty town, and you're going to have a life that is going to depend on you being brave and outspoken and allied to people who don't have your voice. So that would be my advice. Also, this is Betito. Hello.
Thank you, Dr. Solis. Student Dr. Lewis, you're next.
Thank you. And actually, this is a very timely question. I was asked to give a quote a while ago for the new incoming class. So I'll just read that quote because I think that's what I would tell myself. As a physician or healthcare professional, you have the unique ability to lead the changes you want to see in the community you serve, in the nation, and even globally. If all physicians and healthcare professionals made advocacy for social justice their duty, I believe we could help heal the world in a powerful way. As you traverse your medical school journey or health sciences journey, I encourage you to identify social issues that you are passionate about and put effort into researching or even building solutions. Speak up, speak out, reach out, and commit to seeing the change all the way through. Don't underestimate your ability to be a change maker, even as a student.
Well said. Thank you. All right, Dr. Singh.
This is the question about what we would say to our younger selves. Yes, okay. I think I mentioned it before, but yeah, just growing up with, I think, my background, being an immigrant, being a young girl, I think growing up in Stony Brook, Long Island, I didn't have a lot of mentors who look like me and people of role models that I that I could see of a lot of any color really. So I think what I would tell my younger self was that, similar to what everyone's going to say here, is like, we can be the change. Don't listen and don't use the experiences that may be barriers or put you down or believe that you don't deserve a role or a place of where you think you are. That if, I think I would tell my younger self, if you surround yourself with people who support you, keep moving forward, keep learning, keep overcoming. And one day you may find yourself in a role where you're like, wow, this is what I was looking for when I was the younger self.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Singh. And Dr. Hill, we'll if you take that question, and then we'll go to general questions after that.
Let me, this is such an important topic. Let me, so it doesn't get mundane, because we've had some scenarios. So in preparing for this, I read a scenario that I thought rather uniquely describes microaggression for us. I'd just like to share those, so we don't think that's it's something that's so overt. This was a white male professor says to a colleague, "Someone mistook me for a security guard." They asked him, "How did that make you feel?" He responded, "Fine, it was funny." Is this microaggression? Probably not. His feelings weren't hurt. The incident did not relate to an aspect of his identity. No microaggression. However, if you change the race of that individual in the same scenario, the outcome of that scenario might also be changed. An African-American male assistant professor says to someone, "They mistook me for a security guard." Colleague asks, "How did that make you feel?" He responded, "I'm sick of it. No one ever sees me as a doctor. That always makes me feel like I'm less than, I'm not a professional. They don't even acknowledge my degree." This is microaggression. And so what we're hearing today, so it doesn't become something that's nebulous. It's microaggression is a verb. It's not something that it goes across. It's a sensitivity. It's an awareness. It's an education. It's not a destination that you arrive at and say, "I got it now. Okay, I got it. Okay, I've got it." So what I would say to our younger aspiring students, if I could quote a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, which is meaningful to me, and I hope it means something to them. This was given at a sermon shortly before his assassination. And I quote it. He said, "You may be 38 years old, as I happen to be now, and one day, some great opportunity stands before you and calls for you to stand up for some great principle, some great issue, some great cause. And you refuse to do it because you were afraid. You refuse to do it because you want to live longer. You're afraid that you will lose your job, or you are afraid that you will be criticized, or that you will lose your popularity, or you're afraid that somebody will stab you or shoot you or bomb your house. So you refuse to take a stand. Well, you may go on and live until you are 90 years old, but you're just as dead at your present age as if you were 90. And the cessation of breathing in your life is but a belated announcement of an earlier death of the spirit." That's what I would say to them. And that quote, they can find that from Dr. Martin Luther King, if I didn't read it very well. Thank you, Dr. Fernandez.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Thank you very much. What I got from all of this is, I think what I want to say to my younger self is do not be afraid. I spent so much time in fear of, to what you just shared, Dr. Hill, is what am I going to lose? At what risk am I taking to speak up? I worked so hard. Who am I? what doors am I going to close? What bridges am I going to burn? To stand up for what is right, to speak for others, to be an ally, to stand up for myself sometimes. But I think I would say to my younger self, do not be afraid. No regrets. Yeah. All right. So I think at this point it is 10:10. We're just running just a little behind, but that was totally worth it. I would say we could go on for hours talking to our panelists. I feel we've barely scratched the surface. So Gabrielle, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce what we're going to do with the questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all again for this discussion. I think we do have some Q&As coming in, questions coming in, and we'll be answering those questions. Thank you. We do have a couple.
Gabrielle, I've lost track of where the first one was. Would you be able to read the first one maybe?
Yes, I will on one, yes. We have one question. This has been an amazing discussion. I hope the panelists might talk about how they advise people, especially students in the medical fields, to address microaggressions.
Tackled that one, at least from my perspective. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I do spend a lot of time with my medical students, helping them navigate microaggressions when they happen. And I always tell them, first, you get to choose whether or not you respond and how you respond. Microaggressions are personal, responses are personal as well. And whatever you, learner, decide to do, I will support you 100%. I know on my campus, we have a mechanism where the learner can report faculty and physicians and others behaving badly to the student affairs and or clinical affairs office. My learners don't always want to do that, especially not in third year, because they are afraid of retribution. They are afraid of it affecting their grade for that rotation, et cetera. And so we talk through the options. And then I always make sure to just acknowledge what they're feeling. That sounds so hurtful. Thank you for coming to me, for trusting me with this. You know, let's talk about options, things you can do or not do. Again, your decision doesn't have to be made right now, right? So I will also say in my role as an ally, especially last summer, after George Floyd was murdered, we found out about the murder. You know, I realized then what it means to really be an ally, and really be an ally. Being an ally means that you share the risks of the community that you're allied to. That's what being an ally means, as Dr. Hill alluded to. And so, you know, I said several times last summer, oh, if this doesn't get me fired, you know, because it's really how I was feeling. And so, so I make sure, again, that, you know, if my learners need me to amplify their voice anonymously, I do that. If I need to go to the Office of Clinical Affairs and say, listen, we need to figure out how to help our preceptors learn that this is not okay, this is not a good way to act, right? So, so yeah, and you know, like I said, microaggressions are so personal, responses to it are so personal, and it's so situational. Like it's hard to say one pat answer. But yeah, so that has been the approach I take for medical students specifically.
And I'll just quickly add, I tell students, you know, when you're in a situation where you might want to think about the systems of hierarchy that you're working within. For example, Zarya is going to rotation. She's going to start rotation soon. And yes, she's there as a change agent, but she's also there to get that honors grade. Because that's going to matter, you know, especially if she wants that honors grade in the field that she wants to do her residency in. And so how do you work within the systems of hierarchy, but also come out of that experience feeling like you're whole and that you didn't just sell your soul to, for that grade. I tell students, maybe alert the situation and separate yourself by using the word ouch, or express some kind of, maybe just, practice, use a word that you're used to, where you are not, feeling like you're complicit or you're silent with the situation, but you're also expressing some kind of allyship in a prejudicial event by saying, okay, that made me feel uncomfortable, or that's not, that doesn't fit with the way I see the dynamic here, something like that. So getting used to a couple of terms where you're not fully challenging the person that's perpetuating it, but also at the same time, you're asking people to pause around you and saying, let's just pause and think about what just happened here. And sometimes the word ouch is enough for people to stop and say, why, if a person is, for example, if a preceptor is trying to be funny and they don't realize that it might have been a sexist comment or a racist comment, hearing that word ouch alerts them to the fact that I was trying to be funny, but the student just said the word ouch, meaning it was not received in the way I meant it to be. So what's going on here? And they might take you aside later and ask, or you might have that chance. So just an easy thing to remember. I usually think of the right thing to say 3 days later in the shower, I should have said this, and that doesn't usually come to me in an articulate way. But
Dr. Fernandez, if I could, just want to highlight a couple of the points that you made. It's important to separate the intent of the person from the impact. And sometimes microaggressions, they're committed by well-intended people who do not always realize, what they're doing and causing. So it's important to recognize some of the signs of a person who may have suffered microaggressions, and you and Dr. Solis have mentioned them. And I just want to highlight them for us to begin to recognize this phenomenon of microaggression. Or is the person feeling hurt or shocked or angry? Do they think about the experience they had for a long time and say, well, that happened a month ago, that happened last week? Or if the person comes and say, am I really making too much of this? They feel insecure. They think they're making too much of it, or they're unsure that they should, or maybe I shouldn't just bring this up at all. Why? Maybe I'm just making too big deal of it. They become insecure. These are signs of a person that has, just some of the signs that a person has suffered some of the microaggression, have been the recipient. Again, so it's important to recognize those signs so that we can minimize those sort of things when speaking to our colleagues and friends. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could just kind of share, because I do think, in responding to microaggressions, you're being an ally, right? That's what you're being. So there is one definition that I think is really important because it points to a nuance that isn't often talked about. So it reads, allyship is the practice of unlearning and relearning, and is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and groups. And this is the nuance. Our work and our efforts must be recognized by the people we seek to ally ourselves with. That's one key fact. And the reason why I bring that up is because when we're going to be all colors of us, right, being allies, right? And when we're an ally, we can be an ally within our own group, or we might be allying ourselves with a different group that we don't identify with. So it's very important that when we do ally ourselves, when we do respond as an upstander or in defense of a marginalized group, they also see us as an ally. I've been in a number of rooms where, honestly, it's been often white people who have intersectionality, meaning white people who are also gay or lesbian, or white people who have an adopted child of color, and they've said things that were completely wrong, alluding to, the concept of Black people have thicker skin and thus feel less pain, right? That has come up in multiple settings by attending. So there is a hierarchy. And I hope that those individuals can recognize that just because you have intersectionality doesn't give you a pass to say racist and biased things. And that by saying racist and biased things, you are not an ally. So in those situations, And mind you, I'm a second year, so I haven't started rotations yet. But in those situations, I did speak up. What I did was try to give context and unveil the bias behind the comment and remind them with statistics about how detrimental that bias can be. And so, what I have told students when we have a microaggressions training that we give to individuals, and we literally practice role playing how to respond when you hear a microaggression. You can use humor. You can use, the question that I saw in the chat was, why would you say that? My favorite is what Dr. Hill said, separating intent from impact. I know you intended to do this, but the impact was actually this. So you can do all those things and say all those things. But the key thing is just speaking up. And even if the moment passed, like Dr. FP says, 3 days later, you're like, oh, I should have said this in the shower. I still think, even if that in that moment passed, or you, because of the hierarchy, you can't speak up because, there's egos, I still think it's totally appropriate to pull the patient aside, for example, if it's a preceptor who said something biased to the patient, and say, I just wanted to check in with you. I noticed, you looked a little upset, or what this person said was a problem. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. Because even that, at least the person who was hindered and harmed got to receive allyship from you. And then hopefully you'll have an opportunity to speak to the preceptor later and say, hey, I know you intended this, but the impact was this. And hopefully that can change their process down the line. But at least you've dealt with the individual who's been harmed.
Thank you. Gabrielle, do we have another question?
I believe the majority of the questions definitely were asking for those examples, which I know we definitely have provided. If anyone else would like to provide any other examples of how to respond, but that is the general questions that we do have.
If I could, Dr. Fernandez, Paul, as the students who are out in rotations, and you alluded to that earlier in our discussions, and the hierarchy of medicine, and that hierarchy that is a totem pole hierarchy, which means you must be abused before you can be used. I would invite our students moving into the clinical years to read a book that was done in, I believe, in the early 1980s called The House of God, which was describing the internship of the first year intern in New York City. It's a seminal work on that internship. But what do you do with an attending who has your grade in their pocket and affronts you? I'm not going to offer you what I think is the answer. I'm going to give an opinion. I don't know about what the exact answer is. I know that it's wrong, but I would not tell you to do what I might do that could jeopardize your education. But I also think it's wrong that when you are wrong, that you don't speak up. And if you speak up for yourself when you are wrong, then you are further damaged. That is not the model of continued success either. As osteopathic physicians, we say, and our allopathic brother and sister say as well, that we want to be physicians because we want to help people. Well, how do you help people? And when we find attendings that are not helping people, they are giving a prescription or a therapy that they think helps people. Helping people begins long before writing a prescription, long before ordering a diagnostic test. And as osteopathic physicians, the greatest prescription that we can have, and Andrew Taylor still, they asked Andrew Taylor still said, what do you think of antibiotics? He said, I think about antibiotics as much as close as east is to west. Your greatest prescription, our greatest prescription in the healing is in our hands. It is not on a piece of paper. And what is it in our hands? It's an educated knowledge that hopefully a spiritual being will come through and reach another human being. The laying on of hands, which was done usually by men and women of the cloth until it was brought forth by Andrew Taylor skills, not just a laying of hands or a cracking of the bones. It is a spiritual transformation. And so unless you're willing to make that spiritual transformation as osteopathic physicians, you will continue to write scripts and perpetuate that which we not abhor, but find that when it's not indicated. So as osteopathic physicians, yes, there will be challenges to endure. We are a microcosm of the macrocosm. We think that what's going, 85 million people voted for the other guy. You think you're not gonna run into them? 98% of physicians are of one political party or the other. You think you're not gonna see them or him or her? You have to make a decision. And I'm not gonna offer you what that exactly is because I don't know exactly. I know what I would do, and I know that it's wrong, but exactly what you should do, I would not offer that to you as not that I know the answer.
Thank you so much. Well, we are running close to time. So again, I just want to thank you all, Dr. Fernandez Paul, Dr. Solis, Dr. Singh, Dr. Hill, and student Dr. Zarya Lewis very much for participating in this panel. This was such an important discussion, and we look forward to hosting more webinars in this series. Now, one quick note before we do sign off, everyone can see that slide there. We ask that you all take a moment of your time to fill out our webinar survey to tell us what you thought of this webinar. We'll be sending the link out in the chat. And please feel free to take a photo of this as well. We really want to know your thoughts. And again, we hope to continue this webinar series, and we're excited to produce more webinars on this topic. Thank you all so much for attending, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.